the drive for changing things is bad either. Fashion is, to many extents, very, very open and really doesn't matter that much. But there's some cool stuff that comes out, and clothes that people like to wear and identify with, and it helps express some aspect of your personality. And if that's not happening there, if everyone's just wearing the same thing, you don't get that personalisation. And the same thing in games. If FIFA 2007 comes out and is a little bit different to FIFA 2006, it may be that the only difference is it's got all the players from this year in it, or that sort of thing, then that's still an interesting change. And there's still Tomb Raider may have a slightly new setting. That might be a little bit more interesting. Or maybe they'll change something about the gameplay. Maybe something very, very subtle, like Pac-Man to Pac-Man Championship. It doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be earth-shattering. It can still be just a little change that becomes interesting in some way. So, before we actually set up here, there were some emails bounced around, and John said that he was going to complain about innovation being a finite set.
Didn't end up doing it.
So I was going to argue with that, because I think innovation is actually everywhere. We can innovate about a bunch of things, and we listed some of them, but there's more. The development methodology, the method of distribution, the business plan, there's all sorts of different areas that can be innovated, and I think that everyone in this room has got ideas about how they want to do something that is better than... It may be that you just want to make this other game that you've seen, but I want to change this one thing because that would make it better. And it's that drive to make something that's more like what you envisage that I think is what should drive innovation. And so that's really all I wanted to say, apart from the fact that be careful not to innovate too much. There's a bunch of things that you can change, and then you start wondering if it's a game or not, and you start losing the expectations of how to interact with it. Braid changed an awful lot of things, but still used WASD. And those sorts of areas to choose when to change, when to use the arrow keys, when to use WASD, when to use the standard Microsoft controller layout on the Xbox, or when to deviate from it a little bit. I know that with all Microsoft first party, they actually have a massive, it's about a 160-page white paper talking about controller schemes and what different buttons may or may not do. And not from a prescriptive perspective. They're not saying you must make it do this, but they just talk about the intuitiveness of making buttons do these different things. And it starts from the D-pad is a good place to make people move from. And sometimes you might want to change that. Sometimes it's a good idea not to. Picking your battles is where to innovate and where not to, and not being driven. I must change everything, or I must change anything, I think is where we really need to go. I'd love to talk about a bunch of different things that the Interzone's being innovative about. It is an MMO company, but we can still actually innovate in this space. But unfortunately we haven't announced the title yet, so we can't really talk about that. The couple of things that we can do is that we have innovated in the business model. We are self-publishing, and that's an interesting thing to be able to do with a brand new startup game company, to be able to self-publish globally. That's another thing that we're doing a little bit differently. We're a startup that's publishing globally. And we're also innovating a lot in the development model, using Agile in a slightly different way, and embracing some of the things that John suggested as well. We don't have a monolithic design doc. In an MMO, it really doesn't make any sense to begin with. You're going to end up with a 17,000 page document that is obsolete before it's finished, never mind then actually the development of the game that happens even after it's launched. So I really wanted to just set a couple of those things up, and then I think that the real value from this this panel is going to be coming from everyone talking amongst ourselves, and also from questions that we're going to get on. So I'm just going to jump straight through to that. So
thank you very much.
I'll head back to...
Well, I'll get a couple of questions going between the panel before we open up. And one of the things that all three of you talked about was really kind of getting to the idea of innovation not being just blinding a flash of light from God, but from working out nuance and finding a place to turn nuance. And as someone who buys games, I find myself my own worst enemy, whereas I really love games that feel brand new, but at the same time I play a lot of Dynasty Warriors games, which are incremental, only the Madden with swords, basically. And innovation is that line at the top of the box where it says new this year, and there's 3 dot points, better battle system. But at the same time, there's kind of these nuanced things which are like the Pac-Man changes, the subtle changes in the jump mechanics, which alter everything, like billiards, where you change one little thing and the ball's kind of iterate in a completely different way. So I'm just going to open up about how innovation is kind of sold as well. Like you all talked about how to make it, but innovation is also the prime force between right at the top end of the games industry as well. That kind of it's like this, but it has one new mechanic. So do any of you have any kind of thoughts about how innovation is kind of sold as well?
Well, I think you're also talking about innovation as novelty as well.
Yeah.
And the marketing of innovation, the marketing of novelty, we're all like the shiny new things. And I think that the marketing of games and the whole chain of the PR through to magazines, websites, whatever, it's really easy. That's the low-hanging fruit when you want to sell a new game. It does this new thing that you've never seen before, and novelty is attractive. It's nice and easy to sell. Nuance is difficult to sell.
Paul, you mentioned about in the first part of your talk, you were talking about films and novels, and Jonathan, you mentioned it as well. So one of the things that people talk about a lot in sort of when people write about game design is working out what really separates games from other forms. So getting down to the nuts and bolts of film is essentially, no matter what is on screen, a sequential series of images, beyond which you can only change so much. So the central point of games has to be its interactivity. But what I find interesting about when people talk about film like that is that film still is not a stable technology. While it is a sequential series of images, the technology for film changes all the time. It innovates. It has its own traditions and genres. And games do the same thing. Essentially, there's talking about interactivity, but people still play with 20-year-old mechanics and still get back to the core ideas that were we're still sort of iterating kind of Game and Watch kind of mechanics in some places, which is kind of exciting as well.
I think the main thing, and this is something I thought about when Greg Kostaikin was out a couple of years ago, is that one of the main differences between pros and film is that people have kind of grown up with them, and people understand on an almost intuitive level how to articulate the processes behind them. Like everyone knows how stories kind of work on an intuitive level, but I think that a lot of people don't, certainly from my generation, and don't really understand on an intuitive level quite how games work, which is why way back in the kind of the 8-bit days and the 16-bit days, people were trying everything to see what would stick. But now we're kind of coming up with a generation who have a sense of what interactivity means, what a game actually means on an intuitive level. And also with a lot of kind of academia, people are starting to articulate that in a far more formal fashion. I think there are basically 2 types of designers in the world, he says, reducing it to programmer binary. There are intuitive designers who can intuitively make a decision about what direction they're going in and then can afterwards articulate what works about that. And then there are designers who can plan very meticulously what experience they're going for and figure out a way to achieve that. And I think that's something that's only really started to emerge recently. Up until now, we've only really had people who intuitively kind of found their way through that kind of blue blob